probably saw them when you came in. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Ross Hoagland, and welcome to Reasons Forum. You're here tonight, I hope, because you brought some really great questions for Dr. Fuz Rana, and in the online audience, we hope you too also brought some great questions. The event is being live streamed and recorded, so keep that in mind when you scratch your head or scratch your leg or whatever you do. Everybody's going to see it. So please be mindful of the cameras, especially if for some reason you have to use the restroom or leave in the middle of the event. For the in-house people, there's going to be a raffle. I want you to take a look at this. This is for the online people, and over there on the table, we have some cards that you can fill out if you want to be a part of the in-house raffle at the end when we're done. Please text your questions, whether you're in-house or online, to 657-234-0754. You can start texting those questions now. If you are here in-house, you also have the opportunity to ask your questions live afterwards. So Dr. Rana's going to talk for, I said 20 minutes and he said longer. So whatever that's going to be, I hope it's 30 or 40 or... I've been listening to these YouTube videos all week on various stuff, and they're like 57 minutes and an hour and 25 minutes, and that's fine with me. I just bring it on. So I hope you go for a long time. Again, and there will be a survey that you can tell us all about your feelings about this, both online and in-house. So let me introduce Fuz Rana. We're so excited about this. Biochemist Fuz Rana writes and speaks about the evidence for creation emerging from genetics, human origins, and synthetic biology. As Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe, he is dedicated to communicating to skeptics and believers the powerful scientific case for God's existence and the Bible's reality. Please welcome Dr. Fuz Rana.
Well, good evening, everybody. How are you doing tonight? Good. Well, I just want to take a moment and just say thank you for braving the weather and coming out here tonight to the RTB offices for this Reasons Forum event, and so welcome. And then also I just want to say welcome to those of you who are joining the event via live stream. I'm looking forward to having a fun evening talking about some really important questions. Namely, is the Christian worldview scientifically credible? And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is a response to what many people would argue is the most compelling evidence for biological evolution. And how can we look at that evidence from a Christian worldview perspective? Does that evidence demand an evolutionary interpretation? And to get things started this evening, I want to ask you a question. How many of you know somebody that you would describe as interesting and unusual? I mean, who's the first person that comes to your mind when I say that person's interesting and unusual? Well, I've gotten to know some interesting and unusual people over the years, and some of you are actually sitting here in the audience tonight. But perhaps the most interesting and unusual person I've ever known was my friend, the late John Harrelson. And this is a picture of John a couple of years before he died, and you can probably gather from the picture that John was a musician. He devoted his entire life to music. He had a PhD in musicology. He told me one time that he could play 27 musical instruments proficiently, and that included the electric guitar. And people that knew John, that were friends with him, that had known him for his whole life, would tell me that in his heyday, he could play the electric guitar better than anybody they had ever heard. In fact, they compared him to people like Jimi Hendrix and Keith Richards in terms of his capacity to play the electric guitar. John wrote about 1,000 songs in his lifetime. So he was, again, a consummate musician devoting his life to music. Now, I met John, believe it or not, through Facebook. John lived in Ontario, California. I live in Upland, which is near Ontario, but he hung out in Claremont, California, and that's where I hang out. And it turns out that John was fairly prominent in the local Claremont music scene. And some of my friends who played musical instruments knew John. And so Facebook recommended, since we had mutual friends, that I send John Harrelson a friend request. And so I did, and he befriended me. And through that process, I realized, oh, this is the John Harrelson. I actually had John Harrelson albums in my CD collection. And even though John never had a recording contract with a major label, he independently funded and recorded a number of albums over the years. And those are some of the best albums that I have in my CD collection. And in fact, they're prized possessions today. Now, when John and I began engaging each other over Facebook, I learned that John actually had 2 near-death experiences. That he actually died 3 times. The last time, sadly, was final, but he died 2 times from a heart attack each time, clinically dead, and when they revived him, he had reported near-death experiences. So I wanted to get together with John and find out what it was like to have a near-death experience. What was his take on near-death experiences? And so he agreed to have lunch with me. We had a wonderful conversation. We talked for a couple of hours, and after that, we just would get together quite a bit and just hang out and talk about a number of different things. But John had a sense of humor, and so when he performed, he would bill himself as Dead Man Rocking because of his near-death experiences. Now, John, again, devoting his life to music, was very frustrated with life. John's life was characterized by unmet expectations and disappointments. John was a really intelligent person. He was really a very caring person and insightful, a lot of fun to hang out with, but he was also extremely cynical and extremely bitter because he wanted to hit the big time. That was his dream. He just never was able to do that. He was never able to get that recording contract. And what probably compounded his frustration was the fact that his music career got off to an incredibly rapid start. This is a picture of John in the 1960s with a group that he fronted called Hard Luck Boy. And Hard Luck Boy gained prominence in the LA music scene. In fact, they were so good that they opened for acts like Creedence Clearwater Revival, Jefferson Airplane, Led Zeppelin, Janis Joplin, when they would come to LA to perform. And he thought, we're going to get a recording contract with a major label, and in fact, an offer came. But the label had a stipulation that we'll sign you, John, but you got to dump the band, and then we'll put a band around you. And he couldn't do that to his friends and his bandmates. He thought that that's the ultimate act of betrayal, and he thought, I'm good enough, another contract will come, and it just never did. And so John lived a life of frustration because of that. And about a year before he died, a documentary was actually made about his life called Dead Man Rocking. And so you can actually get a copy of this. John lived the life of a rock and roller, and so there's some language in the documentary. Be forewarned if you decide to check it out. But it's a fascinating story about a really fascinating person. Now, what took John's life was diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And in fact, I suspect type 2 diabetes was responsible for the 2 heart attacks that John had. And this really hits home to me because, number one, type 2 diabetes took the life of my friend, but recently I was diagnosed as being pre-diabetic. And there's a really interesting blood test that's now available called the A1C test. Have any of you had that blood work done, that A1C test done? If you haven't, I would recommend that you ask your physician to carry out this test. It's from a biochemical standpoint, it's a really cool test because what it measures is glycosylation level of hemoglobin. And what that means is that when hemoglobin, which is the protein that binds oxygen that's found in red blood cells, when it floats around, when the red blood cells move through the bloodstream, they're going to encounter glucose that's in the bloodstream. And glucose is a very reactive molecule, and it will react with certain functional groups on the hemoglobin molecule, kind of decorating the hemoglobin with glucose. And the higher the blood sugar level is on average over time, the greater the glycosylation level. The lower the blood sugar, the lower the glycosylation level. And if the A1C value is at a certain level or below, you're considered to be normal and healthy. If it's above a certain value or higher, you're considered to be diabetic. But there's this nether region where you're neither healthy or diabetic. And so they've dubbed this being pre-diabetic. Now the good news, even though people that are pre-diabetic have a statistically pretty high chance of developing type 2 diabetes, if you're in a pre-diabetic range, you can actually control your A1C numbers and reduce them through diet and exercise, and under the most extreme conditions with certain kinds of medication. So this is good news, I guess, if you get a pre-diabetic diagnosis, because you can do something about it before type 2 diabetes results. And believe you me, you don't want type 2 diabetes. I can't think of a worse disease to have, quite frankly. I'm sure there are diseases that are worse, but I can't think of a worse one, frankly. Now, the problem with having high levels of glucose in your bloodstream is that glucose is, again, a chemically reactive compound. Glucose is a compound that's used by the cells in our body to generate energy. The cells break down the glucose molecule, and glucose is called a reduced molecule. It's chemically reduced, meaning its chemical bonds have a lot of energy in them. And so when you break it down, that energy is released and can be captured by the cell to power the cell's operations. Well, in order to be a compound that would be good for generating energy, it also has to be a chemically reactive compound. And so glucose is ideally suited because it is chemically reactive. In fact, sugars in general are chemically reactive. That's why when you eat an apple and you take a couple bites and you set it on the counter, it turns brown right away. It's because the sugars are chemically reactive. They're reacting on the surface of the apple. And so this is what makes high sugar levels so harmful, is because they're not only going to react with hemoglobin, they're going to react with every protein in sight that they're exposed to in your bloodstream. And this compromises circulation, which leads to all kinds of problems. Now, because the blood sugar level is so critical in our bodies, we have a very elaborate system that's really elegant and sophisticated that controls blood sugar levels, and it involves two hormones called insulin and glucagon. Insulin is produced by the beta cells in the pancreas, and if the blood sugar levels are high, what will happen is that'll stimulate the release of insulin, and that insulin will cause muscle tissue and fat tissue and the liver to take up the glucose, lowering the blood sugar levels. Now, if the blood sugar levels are too low, another hormone is released. This is called glucagon, and glucagon will stimulate the breakdown of glycogen in the liver and other tissues, and that will release glucose into the bloodstream. But glucagon does something else. It also stimulates the release of insulin, and this is really rather slick or rather sophisticated in terms of the design, because that means that as soon as that blood sugar level is elevated because of the glycogen breakdown, insulin is there to cause the tissues to take up the blood sugar, keeping it again at a normal level. And so when somebody has type 2 diabetes, the problem is that your beta cells are not producing enough insulin. And part of the problem is your beta cells will actually, if they're exposed to enough sugar, will accumulate starch or amylose or glycogen inside the beta cells, and that basically messes up the cell's capacity to release and produce insulin. And so what you have to do to treat type 2 diabetes is to stimulate insulin production by the beta cells. And so people are looking at all kinds of different biomedical approaches to stimulate insulin production. And it turns out that a couple of years ago now, a team of researchers made a discovery that they think may hold the key to treating type 2 diabetes. And it turns out that this discovery involves the duckbill platypus. The duck-billed platypus may actually hold the key to treating type 2 diabetes. And this is a picture of a duck-billed platypus. It is a bizarre mammal. It lays eggs. It's got this duck bill. And in fact, believe it or not, biologists are very interested in the duck-billed platypus because they believe that the duck-billed platypus represents mammals in a primitive state, and whatever they can understand or learn about the duck-billed platypus gives insight into mammalian biology. And so the way evolutionary biologists classify the duck-billed platypus is that it's a monotreme. And from an evolutionary perspective, they would argue that you have an ancestral mammalian group that gave rise to a branch called the monotremes. And then there's another branch that gave rise to two mammal groups, the marsupials and the eutherians, which are the placental mammals. And these are the two groups that dominate the animal world, or at least dominate the mammals that we have alive today. But because, again, the monotremes are considered a side branch, people believe that by studying the duck-billed platypus or other monotremes, they can learn fundamental things about mammalian biology. Now, I have had a chance to actually see a duck-billed platypus up close. My wife Amy and I were in Tasmania, and Tasmania is the home of the duck-billed platypus, as well as parts of southeastern Australia. And they are really neat little creatures. They look like little tiny beavers swimming around. They're just absolutely adorable. And the first thing you think of when you see a duck-billed platypus is, I would love to pick it up and just give it a cuddle, right? I just want to hold this thing and pet it. They're so cute. Well, not a good idea, because the duck-billed platypus doesn't take kindly to that kind of attention. And in fact, the male and the female have spurs on the hind legs. And in fact, the male produces a venom that is so toxic that it can kill a dog and cause human beings excruciating pain. So if you ever get a chance to pick up a duck-billed platypus, you may want to give second thought. And if you can't tell the difference between a male and a female duck-billed platypus, you probably, again, want to leave it alone. Because if you pick up a male duck-billed platypus, you're going to be in for a rude awakening. But it's the venom that actually may hold the key to treating type 2 diabetes. It turns out that in the duck-billed platypus venom is a compound called GLP-1, which stands for glucagon-like protein. And it turns out that GLP-1 is part of a group of proteins or hormones that are called the incretins. And these are hormones that are produced by the gut. And typically, when you eat a meal and you start to digest the food, what's going to happen is your bloodstream is going to absorb those nutrients, which include high levels of glucose. And so what happens is, as soon as you begin to eat food and that food begins to digest, the incretins are released and absorbed by the bloodstream, and GLP-1, or glucagon-like peptide or protein, will actually stimulate the beta cells to release insulin so that your tissues are already poised to take up the glucose as soon as it enters into your bloodstream. So it's a really elegant system that prepares your body to handle the food or the nutrients that are being digested as part of eating a meal. Now, you don't want the GLP-1 protein to hang around for a long time in the bloodstream. And the reason is because if it hangs around for a long time, you'll overproduce insulin, which will lead to basically a low blood sugar. So you want GLP-1 to be short-lived in the bloodstream. And the way this is accomplished is through the use of another protein called dipeptidyl peptidase. And this basically breaks down GLP-1, giving it a relatively short half-life. Now, what happens in the duck-billed platypus venom is that the GLP-1 is actually long-lived. It doesn't break down very readily. It escapes breakdown from the dipeptidyl peptidase. This is actually a good thing in venom, because in venom you want the GLP-1 to persist in the bloodstream of the predator or whoever is messing with the duck-billed platypus. Why? Because that'll cause the insulin levels to elevate, the blood sugar levels to crash, and that will lead to that predator that's bothering the duck-billed platypus to become lethargic and inactive. So it's a really elegant system that the duck-billed platypus has that's a variant on this incretin system. So when I look at this, at the chemical nature of glucose and how it's ideally suited as an energy source, given its reduced nature and its chemical reactivity, and you look at the insulin and the glucagon system that regulates blood sugar levels and the incretin system and how that incretin system has been modified in the duck-billed platypus venom, these are just incredibly elegant and sophisticated designs. These designs are ingenious. They display forethought and pre-planning. There are these elaborate feedback mechanisms, all of which I think characterize designs that we would make as human beings. And so for me, excuse me, for me as somebody who looks at biology as being the handiwork of a creator, I believe that the origin and the design of life and the history of life are orchestrated through a creator's handiwork. I see this kind of system as evidence for design. But there's something that to me is incredibly provocative about what I shared with you this evening. And that is this. It's provocative to think that we could study the venom of the duck-billed platypus, this really bizarre egg-laying mammal that lives in Tasmania, and from that develop insight that could lead to a treatment for type 2 diabetes. Think about that for a minute. That's really remarkable, is it not? That we could actually study the duck-billed platypus and learn something about human biology that could have biomedical application. This, to me, is really, really provocative. And the reason why we can do this is because in the biological realm, organisms have shared designs. Organisms have shared designs. And because of the shared designs, what we learn about one organism is applicable to a wide range of organisms. And the shared designs that organisms possess are referred to as homologies. And homologies essentially, again, refer to shared designs that are possessed by organisms that would naturally group together into a grouping or into a classification. And the quintessential example of a homology is the vertebrate forelimb. And so our arms are forelimbs. We're vertebrates, and our arms are our forelimbs. And it turns out that every vertebrate has the same forelimb design, which consists of a long bone, a humerus, an elbow, the radius and the ulna in the forearm. There are carpal bones or wrist bones, metacarpals in the hands, and then 5 fingers or 5 phalanges. That's called a pentadactyl architecture. And whether it's a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, a horse's hoofs, a dog's paw, or a human arm, everybody has the same design. That it's the same fundamental design. It's the same homologous structure. It's just that those structures are varied in such a way to carry out different types of functions for those different organisms. And homology is not just simply limited to anatomy and physiology. We also see homologies at the molecular level. So this is showing a number of proteins that are found in a wide range of organisms. The protein is histone 1, and you can see that there are the amino acid sequences that make up the proteins are homologous. So homology is not only seen, again, at the anatomical and physiological level, at the molecular level. And this is essentially true for the GLP-1 in humans as part of our incretin system, and in the duck-billed platypus as part of its incretin system and as part of its venom. Those are homologous systems, and it's those homologies that, again, allow us to apply what we learn about the duck-billed platypus to human biology. Now, today, the idea of homology is deeply intertwined with the evolutionary paradigm. In fact, if you ask people, what do you consider to be the most compelling evidence for biological evolution, to a T, biologists would say it's the homologies that we see in the living realm. And the reason why they say this is because homologies in biology today are interpreted within an evolutionary framework. So when it comes to the pentadactyl architecture, the idea would be that the first tetrapod, the first vertebrate that made its way onto the land, Acanthostega or Ichthyostega, would have had a four-limb structure that displayed pentadactyl architecture. And the idea is that this ancestral group would have given rise to a number of different evolutionary lineages where that vertebrate forelimb would have been modified through evolutionary processes, through descent with modification to produce a wide range of structures. And likewise, with the homologies that we see in protein sequences, the idea would be that these homologies, again, reflect an evolutionary history, where the sequence variations reflects, again, an evolutionary history. Now, even though homologies are considered to be, again, an integral part of evolutionary theory, to be the most compelling evidence for biological evolution, interestingly enough, homologies, or the concept of homologies, actually predates Darwin. And the person who, I wouldn't say discovered homologies, but who played a key role in elaborating what homologies are, is a scientist by the name of Sir Richard Owen, who was a biologist of prominence in the United Kingdom in the early to mid-1800s. He's considered the father of comparative anatomy. He is the founder of the modern-day natural history museum systems. He's the one who coined the term dinosaur. And in his day, people thought of him in the same terms they would have thought of Isaac Newton. He would be the biology's version of Isaac Newton in the United Kingdom. Now, Owen, again, discovered the idea of archetypes, discovered homologies, and the way he interpreted homologies was that these were archetypes, that these were archetypes that existed in the mind of a creator that were then functionally manifested in the created order. That's how Owen understood homologies. And this is how Owen defined the archetype. It's that ideal or original or fundamental pattern on which a natural group of animals or system of organs has been constructed, and to modifications of which the various forms of such animals or organs may be referred. And so, what Owen envisioned was that this archetype was an ideal, a pattern, a concept that existed in the mind of a creator that then was manifested in the created order in the homologous structures that organisms possess. And Owen gave a series of lectures to the Royal Society that were published in a book called On the Vertebrate Forelimb, or On the Vertebrate Limb, where he presented the concept of a vertebrate archetype. And this is a diagram from the lectures where he's laying out what he envisions to be the vertebrate archetype. But for Owen, again, the archetype, again, reflected the handiwork of a creator. This is what Owen said in the lectures, that the archetype points to a deep and pregnant principle, some archetypical exemplar on which it has pleased the creator to frame certain of his living creatures. Now, in Owen's day, there was a debate raging among biologists. Was it function that was the most important principle to interpret biology, or was it form? In the UK, following in the footsteps of William Paley, most biologists would argue function was what should organize biology. But Owen favored the thinking on the European continent. With the discovery of homologies, many continental biologists argued that it was form, or homologies, these archetypes that should organize thinking in biology. Owen favored that view, but he sought to unite the two perspectives in a single theoretical framework. And for Owen, he argued that the archetype was the ultimate example of design, because he points out that it's one thing to think of a creator being able to produce these highly elaborate biological systems that display exquisite functionality. That's clearly evidence for design. But to think that a creator could do that while at the same time being constrained by an archetype is the ultimate example of design, because the creator conceived of an archetype that was so robust that it could at the same time, while conforming to a particular form and theme and pattern could also be modified to produce the functionality that we see in biology. And this is what Owen said: "The satisfaction felt by the rightly constituted mind must ever be great in recognizing the fitness of parts for their appropriate function. But when this fitness is gained, as in the great toe of the foot of man and the ostrich, by a structure which at the same time betokens harmonious concord with a common type, the prescient operations of the one cause of all organization become strikingly manifested to our limited intelligence." And so again, Owen saw homologies as reflecting design, reflecting the ultimate example of design. Now, what happens is when Darwin comes along with his theory of evolution, he basically co-opts Owen's concept of the archetype and he evolutionizes it. He turns it into a common ancestor, a hypothetical common ancestor, and then he argues that homologies reflect descent with modification from that common ancestor. And so where Owen saw biology in design terms, in teleological terms, Darwin wanted for biology to be mechanistic. And so his mechanism of natural selection was a way to make biology mechanistic, and he argued that natural selection over a long enough period of time could explain the major groups of organisms and could explain the homologous structures. And today this thinking still persists. But the point I would make here is this, that even though homologies are considered to be the most compelling evidence for evolution, the first point is this, that we can think of homologies in design terms following after Richard Owen. We can think of homologies as reflecting common shared design or an archetypical design that exists in the mind of a creator. In fact, I would argue that this is how we think that when we see shared designs, this is how we think. We think the way Owens thought, not the way Darwin thought. Let's take an automobile as an example. Automobiles have shared designs. They have homologous structures. And when we see the shared designs in automobiles, we recognize that there are these shared designs, these archetypes that are deployed to build automobiles. And we know that automobiles have undergone an evolution over the last century or so, right? But when we look at the evolution of the automobile and the modification of these archetypical designs, we don't think of this as being, again, descent with modification. We recognize that human designers continually modify and vary the archetype in order to create new variations on a design. And so we think about homologies all the time. We encounter homologies all the time, and we comfortably interpret them in a design framework. So why is it that we come to biology, we want to suddenly think of these homologies in evolutionary terms? Now, when I present this argument to people that are skeptics or people that would embrace an evolutionary view of life, the question that I get from both believers and non-believers alike is this: well, why would a creator employ the same designs? And this, what undergirds this question is illustrated by a comment left on my Facebook page by Phil, who is a skeptic. And this is what he said: just think about the diverse range of creatures an actual creator could have made. And yet we see creatures appearing like and acting like family cousins instead. What would compel an actual designer with unlimited power to design all creatures with the same template as if the design was a restriction on the designer? Perhaps it was to make belief more difficult, to make only rebellious, non-credulous hearts disbelieve. Okay, word for word. But the idea behind this is, and I've seen other people express this idea. I've seen evolutionary biologists express this idea that if a creator is all-powerful and all-knowing, and he has access to infinite resources, that he's completely unrestricted, why wouldn't he, as a creator who's compelled to create, produce a world where biological organisms display an infinite array of designs? And in fact, the fact that we see homologies and shared designs is completely contrary to what we would expect a creator like that to do. Therefore, those shared designs, those homologies, are better understood as evidence for common descent, not common design. This is the objection that I see time and time again. Well, the answer to that question is, I don't agree. I actually think that a creator, even though that creator is compelled to create, that has access to infinite resources, I think that creator would actually restrict himself to archetypical designs. Why? Because think about this. If there was a creator that produced a world where there was an infinite array of biological designs, biology would not exist as a discipline. Think about that for a minute. Why is that? Because if I study one organism, I study its biochemistry, I study its cell biology, I study its anatomy and physiology, I've learned an enormous amount about that organism, and that's all I know is about that organism. Now I've got to go over here and I've got to study another organism and from the ground up. Biology might exist as a discipline, but it's going to be very limited. But if you have a world where there are shared designs, now suddenly biology becomes possible. Suddenly the biological realm is intelligible. Now this to me is really eerie. Even if you adopt an evolutionary view of life, isn't it eerie to think that the very process that, from an evolutionary perspective, that generated these homologous structures is actually what's making biology possible? It's mind-blowing to think that you could study a virus or a bacteria or a yeast cell and learn about its biochemistry, and that biochemistry applies to every living organism on the planet because biochemical systems are universal. Or that we could study the biology of prokaryotic cells in a single eukaryotic cell and understand the cell biology of every organism on the planet. That's mind-blowing when you think about it. Or that we could study the physiology and the anatomy of the duckbill platypus and from that learn about the biology of every mammal that exists, fundamental insights. We can study the genetics of fruit flies and apply that understanding to human genetics. We can study how the nematode develops embryologically speaking, and that insight tells us how our own embryological development takes place. We can study sea slugs, and from studying their nervous system, we can understand how our nervous system works. This is amazing, isn't it not? The power of the shared designs in terms of making nature intelligible. Now, as somebody who is a Christian and who sees design, authentic design in biology, the question is, well, why would a creator do that? Well, if biology is intelligible, it means that this creator who designed the world in this way wants us to know something about biology. And Scripture teaches us that God has revealed himself to us through the record of nature. And so by making biology intelligible, we now have access to some of the most incredible designs that exist in nature. Designs that I think point to a creator's existence, to a creator's handiwork, that tell us something about the creator's nature. And so the fact that biology is intelligible is mind-boggling, but it's consistent with the Christian worldview and a creator who wants to make himself known. But also the fact that we have these shared designs in biology also means that God's providence is unleashed. Okay, that by studying biology with the shared designs, we now can understand enough about the living world that we can actually be stewards and caretakers of the planet, which is a mandate given to humanity when human beings were first created. That we can understand how ecosystems work and how different organisms fit in those ecosystems. We can understand how plants grow, how animals can be domesticated, and that makes agriculture possible, which leads to human progress and human flourishing. That we can understand how to modify these designs and manipulate these designs, and that leads to biotechnology. That we can understand how human biology works, and this leads to medicine. Medicine is possible because of shared designs, because we can't do a lot of the experiments we need to do to develop drugs and new medical procedures unless we work on laboratory animals first. And so God's providence is unleashed, that the intelligibility of biology reflects the Creator's love and care for humanity. And so, why would a Creator employ the same designs? I think there are very good theological and philosophical reasons why a Creator would limit himself in that way. And I would agree with Richard Owen. The fact that a Creator could have a universal set of biochemistry, and that could be enough to satisfy the biochemical needs of every organism on the planet, is the ultimate example of design, is it not? And so, to me, this idea that homologies represent the best evidence for evolution and must only be understood exclusively in evolutionary terms simply isn't true. That we can present a robust theoretical framework for understanding homologies from a creation model perspective, and that this is consistent with the Creator's nature and character as revealed to us through the pages of Scripture. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end my talk there and invite Ross to come up, and I guess we're going to move now into a time of Q&A. And while we're doing this transition, I would just remind you, for those of you that are watching via the live stream, if you go to this web address, reasons.org/fuzzrf, you can actually get a free download of a chapter in a book, Building Bridges. And the chapter that you get as a download relates to some of the concepts and ideas that we talked about tonight. And also, I guess if you're here today live at the RTB studios, you're also welcome to go to that same web address as well. Okay.
Let's give Fuzz a hand. Thank you. That was a terrific talk, Fuzz. It was very smooth.
Thank you.
I think you went over it a few times. We have a question that's asked, what is the difference between homology and convergence?
Oh, that's a great question. Owen also elaborated on what he called at that time analogies. And so homologies are shared designs that exist in organisms that naturally group or cluster together. Analogies refer to shared designs in organisms that are in completely different groups. And today, we call analogies convergence because analogies are interpreted in an evolutionary perspective where the argument is that natural selection forced different starting points to the same endpoint, that natural selection funneled different designs to the same outcome or the same endpoint. Now, I personally think that convergence represents one of the greatest challenges to the evolutionary paradigm because given the nature of evolution's mechanism, which is an unguided, undirected process that is historically contingent, that is predicated on a sequence of chance events, you don't expect that type of process to repeat itself. Or if it does, it's going to be a rarity or an oddity. In fact, the late Stephen Jay Gould coined a concept called historical contingency, and he used this metaphor that if you rewound the tape of life and replayed it, the outcome would be different every time. And so therefore, he didn't expect to see the repeated origin events independently in nature, and yet convergence characterizes the biological realm. We see convergence at the anatomical level, physiological level, at the molecular level. We see behavioral convergence. And it's not just an odd example here or there, it's a characteristic feature or pattern. And so to me, that's inconsistent with what you'd expect the evolutionary mechanism to produce, and I think represents a really serious challenge to an evolutionary interpretation of life.
Good, thank you. You did a great job putting common design at least on a par with common descent. What would you say to a skeptic pushes it over the top as a better explanatory model?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I'll begin to answer that question by making a point that I heard my friend A.J. Roberts make, and that is the idea that data underdetermines theories. In other words, two theories can look at the same set of data, and actually both theories can explain that data set. And so I think this is really what you're looking at with common design or common descent is two theoretical frameworks that actually can equally account for the data. Where I think what would, in my mind, would favor common design would actually be this idea of convergence. Because that is something that I don't think naturally flows out of an evolutionary framework, but actually fits perfectly in a design framework. Because again, this idea of designers using shared designs, again, makes a lot of sense. And so a creator wouldn't be limited to just having, again, shared form or homologies, but also could also have shared designs in the form of systems that look superficially identical, perform the same function, but actually possess fundamentally different designs. So I think convergence may actually tip it over the edge. Another problem, real quickly, is that many times interpreting homologies in an evolutionary framework is not straightforward, because you actually wind up with a problem called incongruities. The way people interpret homologies is to build evolutionary trees, which are called phylogenetic relationships. And it turns out that many times the evolutionary trees that you build with anatomical features don't agree with evolutionary trees you would build using amino acid sequences for proteins or DNA sequence with what are called the molecular trees. And many times the molecular phylogenies don't agree with each other depending on the different regions of the genome that you look at. And this is a pervasive problem that evolutionary biologists are wrestling with. How do we eliminate incongruities in phylogenetic trees, because you wouldn't predict them to be there if indeed there was an evolutionary history for life. So that's another problem, I think, with the common descent model.
Good, thank you. I forgot to say that if there's people in-house that want to ask a question via the microphone, we're going to start a lineup right over here. There's the mic. So, Charlie, you look like you want to ask a question. We'll probably alternate between the live questions and the text questions. Fuzz, this is my question, and I'm up here, so I get to ask it. Did Richard Owen's ideas die out gradually, or when Darwin came along, was he just pretty much forgotten?
That's a great question, and this comes up when I engage skeptics all the time. And the answer to that question is really involved, but part of it is biology was the last scientific discipline to be thoroughly teleological. Every other discipline, physics, chemistry, geology, were at the time of Darwin, were basically mechanistic disciplines, where it was mechanism that was the explanation for what you saw in physics and chemistry and geology. And yet here biology is that one standout where it's design influence, strong, and this is of course the shadow that William Paley cast. And so in a sense there was mechanism envy in biology, and so when Darwin came along and proposed a mechanism to explain, again, the origin of species and the origin of major groups and the design that we see in biology, that became very attractive scientifically. And so I think Owen's ideas were more abandoned than they really were falsified. Interestingly enough, Owen was rather old when Darwin proposed his theory, but he was a staunch anti-evolutionist to the day that he died. There's a great book written by a guy named Nicholas Rumpke about Owen's life and his science, and this work and access to Owen's papers were granted by Owen's family. Owen, as prominent as a scientist as he was largely lampooned in the latter years of his life. And so people today have forgotten about his very important scientific contributions. And again, he's kind of lampooned. And so in an attempt to try to recapture his reputation, Nicholas Rumpke actually is arguing, well, Owen was a closet evolutionist. He just had a grudge against Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, so therefore he was opposed to Darwin, but he really was an evolutionist at heart. And he just used this religious language to satisfy the clerics of that time. Well, I don't know. I've actually read On the Vertebrate Limb by Owen, and it doesn't look to me like he's using religious language just to satisfy people, but rather it really looks like this is a position that he genuinely holds to. So, I think part of the reason is, again, the desire for biology to be mechanistic.
And not have God in it.
Yeah. Or that one cause, right?
Yeah. Charlie.
Yeah, Fuzz, this is great. Convergences, and now I love what Hugh teaches in his classes about extinctions. And I'll call Darwinists, and non-Darwinists, we'll call them Owenists.
Okay.
And if they converge today, it's like Owen has been erased. I never heard of this man before. How does extinctions make the mess that it makes with these fellows trying to convince us that their 2 points of views are, one of them is better or actually worse than the other?
Yeah. I guess I'm not really sure what you're getting at. I could go a number of different directions with this, but let me just make sure I'm answering your question.
Don't extinctions kind of mess things up for Darwinists and the conversions? They're cut off and they have to start over again.
Okay, yeah.
And they're multiple and they're on the grand scale. And Owen's argument seems to stand a little bit better, because if there is a loving God that did it this way, to be discoverable, as you've said, it would make more sense that in Hugh's books, The Improbable Planet, he's building up the biomass on the planet so that our modern civilization could be here.
Yeah.
And if extinctions have never happened, our biomass would be completely different, right, and those convergences would be different too.
Yeah. Yeah, I see where you're going with that question. I think you're raising an interesting point. To me, what I find most provocative about extinctions, and by the way, kind of what Stephen Jay Gould saw as the arbitrariness of extinction events was part of the reason why he argued for historical contingency. Was that, in other words, the fact that we have mammals dominating the earth today was not due to the fact that mammals outperformed or better suited or could outcompete, dinosaurs, but rather it's because the dinosaurs were wiped out by this extinction event. So the idea of historical contingency is deeply intertwined with the idea of extinctions. But and so I guess it would depend on the scale of the extinction, right, as to what you'd expect to see in terms of kind of the reintroduction of certain types of designs in biology. And I think you're making an interesting point. But to me, what I think is, most provocative about extinction events is the rate in which new ecosystems emerge after an extinction event. It's so rapid. It's unbelievable how rapid. And when you look at a history of life where you can see both major and minor extinctions, and you overlay the loss of species or the loss of groups, and then the origination of new groups after the extinction, it's so tightly coupled. And the recovery time is less than 10 million years, which is now you're getting into the resolution of the geological layers. So within the resolution of the geological layers, you see entire ecosystems recover. And to me, I think that's extremely provocative and probably more problematic for an evolutionary interpretation of life than wiping out designs and then seeing those designs reappear. But you also see these organisms that are, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name of them now. But they basically, you see them in the fossil record and then they'll disappear for a vast period of time and then suddenly they reappear in the fossil record. What's that?
Corals, Lazarus taxa.
Lazarus taxa, yeah, thanks you. Yeah. My age is getting to me. It's like, I know what that word is, it's right here, but.
Here's a really thoughtful question from Zeke in Florida. Due to man's sinful nature, I'll start over. Due to man's sinful nature, the nature of shared design can also be used immorally. I'm thinking of the current trend towards tinkering with the human genome. 2 questions. Are you encouraged or discouraged by the propensity of man to misuse this paradigm? Do you want to answer that, and then I'll do the second one?
Oh, go ahead and read the second part, too.
Number 2, do you see evidence that the designer engineered characteristics that make it difficult to misuse common design?
That's a great question. From my perspective, I think that when you look at the mandate given to humanity at the time of humanity's creation, to multiply and fill the earth, to subdue the earth, to be a caretaker for the planet, I think that mandate really motivates a characterization or a study of nature. In order to be caretakers of the planet, we have to study nature. And even in the Garden of Eden, you saw Adam learn to work the garden. Adam named the animals, and naming in that context implied that Adam understood what these creatures were like, that the name reflected their character, their nature. So Adam was the first zoologist. So he's encouraged to study the world around him, and he has to do that in order to bring the world under his control. I think that, in my view, the vision was that the order that existed in the Garden of Eden was to be spread throughout the entire planet, converting a wild, uncontrolled planet into a planet under Adam and Eve's and their descendants' control. And that required, again, what we would call science and what we would call technology. And you know, when you look at the archaeological record, what characterizes human beings is our sophisticated technology at the very outset. So I think science and technology are a strong motivation that flows out of a Christian worldview. It's integral to who we are as human beings. And so I see the fact that God has created a world with these shared designs as essentially putting in place a framework so that biology is designed for discovery and for use of that. So I think what we see with what's happening in synthetic biology, where people are genetically engineering new organisms or developing other biotechnologies, is actually consistent with the Christian mandate. The problem, in my view, isn't trying to play God, because if we bear God's image, then we have no choice but to play God, because we're image bearers, right? We're going to mimic our Creator imperfectly, but mimic our Creator. To me, the problem is trying to take God's place. So there's nothing inherently wrong with developing technology or gaining scientific insight. The misuse comes from our sinful nature, but this is why I think it's very important for Christians to occupy these disciplines, so that we're bringing salt and light into those disciplines, bringing wisdom, but also bringing a moral framework that would lead to the proper use of that technology and try to eschew the misuse of that technology. So I'm not really troubled by this, other than, I don't think we want to be naive about the potential misuse, but this is all the more reason why we need to understand the technology, and we need to actively engage this, not only at a cultural level, but by actually having Christian students going into these disciplines.
Good. Thank you, Fuzz. We have another live microphone question.
Hello. All right. So yeah, I'm just finishing up your book on Who Was Adam, and I just want to say, first of all, incredible. I was just really gripped by it. And if anybody's interested remotely in human origins, you got to pick it up. That being said, I want to try and fit in, hopefully compress a couple questions. So the first, during the course of the book and elsewhere, it's I want to know, how does an evolutionary biologist or an evolutionist account for the stasis? And then I came up with my own sarcastic kind of like poking term, because everywhere you see throughout the fossil record, I came up with the term instantaneous gradual macroevolution, because everywhere you see it bursts into existence. And then things like Homo ergaster erectus, you have this just 1 million years of no change in tool use. So it seems to contradict the basic tenet and paradigm of evolutionary theory. And if I could fit in one other kind of idea that I deduced in the course of the book, I noticed when humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, come on scene, there's the possibility for religious expression, but that's not there. But to me, that seems that can be somewhat indicative, even if only indirectly, of the idea of no graven image. And then throughout human history, some anthropologists call human beings homo religioso. So it seems like that could actually fit in our own paradigm.
Yeah.
If you could comment on that, that'd be outstanding.
Yeah. Well, with respect to the first question, I would agree with you. This idea of that things appear suddenly and then there's stasis, to me, is something that I think fits better in a creation model framework than an evolutionary framework. And what's interesting is when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, he had a chapter devoted to problems with his theory. And one of those problems was basically that things appear suddenly and don't seem to undergo change in the fossil record. Now, Darwin argued that paleontology and geology are relatively in their infancy at the time that he wrote the book, and he felt that as people characterized the geological column, more fossils would be discovered, and these patterns that were troubling to his theory would actually disappear, and what was needed to support the theory would come into focus. Well, that hasn't happened in 160 years. Instead, what we see is the patterns that troubled Darwin about the fossil record are patterns that still persist today. And so I see this as essentially a failed prediction. And so I would agree that that's problematic. Now, you have people, and this is, of course, a number of years ago now, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Aldridge proposed this idea of punctuated equilibrium. And punctuated equilibrium was basically a model that essentially it really described the patterns in the fossil record. It didn't really explain them. But Gould and Aldridge were basically saying, look, we need to be honest about what the patterns actually show. And what we're looking for doesn't exist. And so these are the patterns. And so people have struggled to try to explain, again, how you would have these very rapid transitions in the fossil record, again, followed by stasis. In my view, I've never seen really a compelling mechanism that was presented. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this idea for religious capacity is that since I've written the update to Who is Adam, I've been spending more additional time just studying the archaeological record, and in the process have come across work by an archaeologist, anthropologist by the name of David Lewis Williams, who offers an interpretation of the art that we see. And it turns out that we now have evidence for art in Southeast Asia that's actually slightly older than the art in Europe, and that art is identical. The same type of hand stencils, the same type of animal depictions, and it's throughout Southeast Asia. So this is really indicating that artistic expression existed in humanity well before we began to migrate around the world. In fact, there's rock art produced by the sand that dates at about 72,000 years in Africa that also has certain elements about it that's similar to the cave art that we see in Europe. And in fact, Shiragu Magawa, who is a linguist at Harvard University, check that, at MIT, actually argues that if the sand are making art at 72,000 years that is similar to the art in Europe and in Asia, the sand diverged from the human lineage about 125,000 years ago, which means that artistic capacity must exist prior to about 125,000 years ago, which is about when we're beginning to see evidence for the modern human anatomy appear in the fossil record. This is where you begin to see the globular skull shape. Now, what's interesting is David Lewis Williams actually argues that the art reflects a deeply religious culture. And he argues that the art is essentially representation of the visions that shaman would have had. And so he argues that the very first humans actually had a complex picture of reality where there was a physical reality and an immaterial reality, and that immaterial reality or that spirit realm influenced the physical realm. And he argues that people viewed that deeper into the earth you went, the closer you got to that spirit realm where the spirits resided. And he argues that the cave walls represented the veil between the two realms, and that the shaman would go into these caves, go into a hallucinogen-induced trance, would have these visions that were then depicted on the walls. And these depictions are in these incredibly difficult to access chambers in these caves, and they're massive in scope. But he also argues that the hand stencils that you saw were actually attempts with people trying to connect with the spirit realm. And so there's areas in the cave wall where you see these hand stencils everywhere. And he argues that this is a deeply religious experience. And in fact, the sand rock art in Africa that dates at 72,000 years is in a place where you get this really interesting acoustical effect that complements the art. And that acoustical effect, he believes, was interpreted by them as being the spirit realm communicating with the physical realm. And so the idea that humans have a religious capacity, I think, is reflected in the nature of the artwork, or at least in David Lewis Williams' interpretation of the art. So he doesn't see it as merely depicting the world around us as first humans, but rather reflecting a deeply ingrained religious system. And obviously it would be a religious system that would have been a strong deviation from what Adam and Eve would have experienced in their relationship with God. But of course, that kind of makes sense when you read what Scripture teaches, right? Yeah. About the rebellion of humanity. Yeah. So.
Thank you. Fuzz, has Francis Collins responded to your thesis? And if so, what was his response? I guess that gets to the bigger picture of
this idea of common design.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've had actually conversations with Francis Collins and other people at BioLogos about this, and they just argue that the best interpretation is common descent, not common design. And what probably motivates that more than anything is what people have interpreted as junk DNA or non-functional DNA in the genomes of humans and the great apes, because what you see are these so-called junk DNA sequences that are shared among humans and great apes, among a wide range of organisms. And now what you have are these shared designs, or these homologies that reflect non-functional elements. And so the argument it would be, this can only be understood in evolutionary terms. But again, the rejoinder to that is we're learning that junk DNA is actually functional. And so I've written a number of articles on the ENCODE project that's on our website that people should take a look at, that have revolutionized the way that we're thinking about the genomes of organisms and junk DNA, where the argument is that almost everything in the human genome is functional in some capacity.
Wow.
So,
do we have another question?
Okay, so mine's on a pretty controversial topic lately, the human and Neanderthal interbreeding. So I read your updated version, 2015, Who Was Adam? And I read, it just didn't fit seamlessly, is what you said in the book. But, this is something I even lost sleep over. But, and I was reading through other forums, like other people like William Lane Craig and stuff like that, saying they just had to reach an intellectual, satisfaction on it. But I've seen in other sources that said the signal would have been so weak that it wouldn't have affected the image of God. So are we making this more of an issue than we need to? Do you feel like it's more of an issue? Yeah, that's basically what my question is.
That's a great question. And, my preference, frankly, would be that there was no interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals, or humans and the Denisovans. That would be my preference. And I don't think the case is open and shut for interbreeding, though today probably among anthropologists it's taken as dogma that there was interbreeding that took place. I'm not completely convinced that it did happen. I'm probably 80% convinced it happened, 20% convinced or not unconvinced. What convinces me is the fact that in the human genome, while each person that's from a Eurasian descent would have about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, we don't have the same Neanderthal sequences. And you can literally construct 40% of the Neanderthal genome just from human DNA samples. That to me is very difficult to explain away in any other way than there was actually interbreeding that happened. On top of that, you also have 3 or 4 modern human remains that have been recovered in Europe that date at about 40,000 years in that time window. 3 or 4 separate samples studied by 4 different teams that show Neanderthal sequences that are higher in percentage, about 10 to 15%, and those sequences are more contiguous. They're longer in scope. And so that to me is, I don't know how you would interpret that other than there was interbreeding, because that's exactly what you would expect. Now, what to me counts against it would be the fact that the population sizes of humans that were migrating into Europe and Asia were very small. We've got a lot of genetic evidence that indicates Neanderthals were small insular populations where there was a lot of inbreeding. So the likelihood of encounters to me seems to be rather remote. On top of that, the developmental trajectory of Neanderthals and humans was really very different. Neanderthals didn't have adolescence. The brain development took very different trajectories. And I'm not so sure that you could get viable offspring given that difference in development. And then my friend Sue Dykes, who's a paleoanthropologist, has pointed out that you also have these things called Neanderthal gene deserts, where there are vast regions in the human genome where there's no Neanderthal signature whatsoever. And you wouldn't expect that if there was actually interbreeding. And just recently, there was an article published saying that the loss of Neanderthal sequences from the human genome happened very rapidly. It wasn't a long, protracted process, but it happened very rapidly, which again to me is problematic. It doesn't fit what I would expect to see. So the point is, there are these observations that I don't know how you would understand any other way than interbreeding took place, but there's these other observations that to me I don't think fit comfortably in any kind of model that I've seen for how that interbreeding took place. So to me, I think it's still an outstanding question, though again, among anthropologists, they would argue that the case is open and shut, but I'm not convinced that's true. Now, let's say for the sake of argument, interbreeding did happen. I think it becomes a theological question at that point. And to me, I think it all boils down to how do we understand the image of God, and how do we understand the process of ensoulment. And there's 2 models for ensoulment. One is the creationist model, where in each embryo, God is creating the soul, and there's biblical passages that seem to support that. Well, then you could take the view that even if humans and Neanderthals interbred, that hybrid, though God would be displeased with that hybrid, still because it came from a human parent, that God would honor that, if you will, and could create a soul in that hybrid because one parent is human. The other possibility, the other model is transducionism, and you could argue the idea is that the soul comes from kind of an intermixing of the 2 parents' soul. Well, again, if the image of God isn't divisible, you can't have half an image of God, you either have it or you don't, and so therefore even if one parent had it, you could argue that the hybrid would have it. So I think there's ways that you could account for that hybrid having, the image of God. Now, I mean, something that's interesting though is if these hybrids really did exist, they really weren't healthy. In fact, there's no evidence for Neanderthal DNA in the human Y chromosome, which means that none of the hybrids that at least that were able to reproduce were males. So either the males were sterile or they didn't live. So it's only the female hybrids that actually would have lived according to that view. And even then, the thought is that hybrid was really not healthy, was just on the cusp of fecundity. And so, make of that what you will, I guess. But, we also are assuming that it was humans that initiated the contact with Neanderthals. What if it was the other way around? And what if that was actually, forced, right? Then you had a very different scenario in terms of how these humans are viewing the hybrids, right? And so, it's a complex question. It would be easier. Life would be easier if there wasn't interbreeding. But, I think we also have to deal with the data honestly. But I think the larger point is that there are ways we can make sense of this and still retain the idea that humans uniquely bear God's image, without, I think, doing a lot of harm to a biblical view of humanity or a biblical anthropology. Yeah, but.
Thank you. Fuzz, here's a question from Los Angeles. While many would like scientific evidence for God, he says, if I see it, touch it, or smell it, then I'll believe it. But since God is spirit, how does one experience the supernatural?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And I'll preface this with this comment, is I've never seen, touched, or smelled an electron. But as a chemist, I'm pretty convinced that electrons exist. And I'm convinced that they exist because I can see phenomena in nature that can only be explained if an electron exists. Okay, but again, there's no direct observation of electrons, to my knowledge. Mm-hmm. We're inferring electrons' existence from the patterns and the behaviors that we see in nature. And predictions that flow out of quantum theory that are satisfied. And so likewise, just because we can't see, touch, smell, or handle God, if you will, or put God in a test tube, doesn't mean that we can't have evidence for God's existence based on the fingerprints that God would have left behind in creation. Just as, at a crime scene, the person who's perpetrated the crime is going to leave behind evidence that he was there, even though we may never meet him or see him or discover or find him. We still know that there was an intelligent agent in that room because of the fingerprints they left behind or because of disturbances that we see in the room. And so you can conduct a scientific investigation of the world and draw a reasonable scientific conclusion that God exists indirectly or through indirect evidence for God's involvement in nature. So, and by the way, I would argue that, in a sense, design, if you will, is already part of science. We already draw design conclusions in science. SETI is predicated on the idea that we can detect electromagnetic radiation from a distant astronomical object and determine whether that radiation emanated from an intelligent civilization or from a natural source. That's design detection, right? And so, or these fast radio bursts that every so often make the news because people speculate that this may reflect the activity of an intelligent civilization. And in fact, there was even a paper published by a team of astronomers from Harvard towards that end, and they're arguing that we have no idea about the motivations of this intelligent civilization or even what their capabilities are, but we can infer some of that from the fast radio burst if these really are signatures for an intelligent civilization. That's, again, an intelligent design model. Or archaeology, right? We can pick up a rock and we can tell whether that rock has been shaped by natural forces or by some kind of agent. And we can tell something about the agent's cognitive capacities from the rock that they've produced. So archaeology is an ID discipline. So, this idea, and so you could take the same techniques that someone would use in archaeology and apply it to any phenomena that we see in biology or in astronomy and legitimately draw the scientific conclusion of design, and even begin to parameterize what that designer must be like, what that designer's capabilities must be like. So, I think this idea of putting God in the test tube is a wonderful rejoinder for skeptics to throw out there, but it really doesn't hold up to careful thought.
Thank you, Fuzz. Do we have another question live?
Yes, thanks very much. You're doing a great job, Fuzz. Just on the last part there and about design, it's interesting that we talk about design, and I think God's word, he says, if we look around at nature around us and we don't get it, that there is a design there, then we don't have an excuse, really. We got some great evidence from 3 Nobel Prize winners, 2016, that spent 33 years trying to build some little molecular machines. And they managed to weave a few atoms into circles to make little wheels, a few more to make axles, a few more to make chassis, and they can stimulate it with ultraviolet light. However, these are almost infinitely more simplistic than any of the molecular machines built in here every day.
Yeah.
And so we've concluded, after 3 decades of research, that it takes super intelligence, like way beyond mankind's level, to build these molecular machines in here. So evolution, not having any intelligence to work with, is out of the race as far as, how are living things constructed, how are molecular machines and cell parts made. So anyway, that's how we feel we can deal with the evolutionist idea. And that it's not common descent, it's a common designer and builder. So if you've got a design, that's one thing, but now what do you do with it?
Yeah.
You see, the engineer's going to tell you, now you've got to build it. So these parts of ourselves have to be built. I think that's another thing. Yeah. Quick question on this window of opportunity that we have now, where there are a number of states that want an alternative to Darwinisms to teach in their science class. And I just wonder if you know of any science in the works that is close to being ready to replace Darwinisms.
I would first of all be surprised if the idea of getting some alternative to Darwinism into a science classroom would ever stand, because the mechanism by which people are doing that is largely political, and all it takes is for there to be a change in the regime, and anything that is gained is going to be lost. So I just don't think that, in my mind, that's actually an effective strategy. I think that what we're doing with that approach is really, I think, galvanizing the scientific community against design and against a creation model approach. And in fact, the pendulum has swung so far the other way that people's careers are in jeopardy if they even bring up those topics. I remember when I started with Reasons to Believe nearly 20 years ago, Hugh would let me tag along with him when we do university events, and we were always welcomed. I always felt like we were welcomed on university campuses to talk about is there scientific evidence for God's existence, to talk about intelligent design, to challenge creationism, and there would be vigorous debates. There would be opposition to us. But we were welcome there to discuss those issues. As soon as the ID movement began to try to politicize ID and move it into the classroom, it created such a backlash that the effect has now been that these conversations can't happen in a science classroom or in a high school setting or a college setting without there being serious repercussions, for people that bring it up. Whereas just even a couple of decades ago, people were having these conversations all the time. And so I think trying to ramrod a creation model or ID into the classroom is just not an effective strategy. I think the strategy we need to take is to actually engage the scholars at the top levels and try to sway them that what we're presenting here has actually got some scientific merit, and let it trickle down. And I think in the meantime, what we need to be doing is actually in church settings is actually train our students how to think about science-based issues and how to process, some of these issues so that when they go into the science classroom, they're going to be capable of handling what comes their way, and they're going to recognize that there's alternative ways to think about this. So I think we're better off taking control of the instruction in a church setting and helping our students understand this than trying to rely on the public school system to do the work for us. So I just don't think at the end of the day it's a really good strategy, and what it does is just makes everybody very angry with an ID or creation model approach unnecessarily. So.
Fuzz, I think we have time for one more question. Does similar morphology mean similar genetics? For example, are human hair and chimpanzee hair genetically similar?
Yeah, I think in general the answer would be yes, that you do see similar genetics in that the genetics reinforces that the genotype reinforces the phenotype. Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe we have time for one more then. Yes.
He was waiting.
Oh, great. This will be our last question.
Actually, better be a good one. It's probably going to sound elementary because I don't have a background in biology, but I think the argument of form over function is somewhat constrained just in listening to you talk. I mean, even if God wanted to create all these different species and organisms that were very, very different from one another, wouldn't they have to be similar to one another in whatever universe or world that he created, just by virtue of the fact that they're close to one another and they have to interact with one another? And I mean,
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to have, that's a good point that you're bringing up. That if you're going to have ecosystems where you have these organisms interacting with each other, that shared designs are going to be really critical in that kind of a framework. So that's actually, a really good point. And I think what you're bringing up here is reinforcing, the point that I was trying to make, is that there are very good reasons why a creator would create a world the way that it looks, and that the restrictions on the infinite designs by sticking to a common form makes a lot of sense from a lot of different levels.
Especially if they're going to eat each other. They kind of have to have similar biology to digest it, huh?
Yep, because everybody is somebody's lunch.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for participating here. There's some surveys on your chairs. If you'd please give us your feedback. For those of you who are live streaming, there should be a button on your screen in the top right-hand corner that you can click on to answer some questions and help us make this better every time. Next month's Reasons Forum will be Thursday, February 28th, again at 6:30, and A.J. Roberts, who is a virologist, is going to be speaking. That one's going to be really good. I also want to remind you about a really exciting opportunity for our national conference coming up in March, the AMP conference. How many of you here have been to the AMP conference before? If you haven't gone, you got to go. It is fabulous. Fuzz gave the highlight talk last year on transhumanism. Every year there's 2 or 3 or 5 really standout talks. So please check out this video, and we'll see about this year's.
Time is precious. Every hour, every minute, every second is a gift. What we do with that time matters. As time goes on, fewer and fewer Christians are sharing their faith. It's time to change that. At AMP, you will be equipped to evangelize by some of the best speakers in the world. Hugh Ross, Sean McDowell, Abdu Murray, Jim and Karen Covell, Erica Carlson, Phil Allen Jr., and more. James 4:14 says we are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Let's use our time to spread the hope that we have in Christ. It's time to break through. It's time to reach out. It's time to share hope. It's time to move forward. It's time to be ready. It's time to unleash your purpose.
That's ampconference.com to go to. It's a 2-day apologetics conference that aims to amplify the voices of Christians in sharing their faith with the world. There's going to be 11 speakers this year. Just for those of us here at the Reasons Forum, we have a special offer. If you use the code ReasonsForum, you can save 10% off the 2-day tickets. Again, go to ampconference.com. And I want to say thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again on February 28th, and let's give Fuzz a hand again. Thank you, everybody. And for those of you that are in-house, fill out a card. We're going to do a raffle, and you can get some free gifts. So thank you.